message given by extraterrestrials. At last, science replaces religion. Book 1. The book which tells the truth.
Chapter 1. The Encounter.
Ever since I was 9 years old, I had but one passion: motor racing. I founded a specialist motorsport magazine in 1970, simply to be able to live in the environment of a sport where man is constantly trying to surpass himself while striving to surpass others. Since my early childhood, I had dreamt of one day being a motor racing driver, following in the footsteps of someone as famous as Fangio. Thanks to contacts made through the magazine I founded, I was given the opportunity to race, and about 10 trophies now adorn my apartment as a result of those races. On 13th of December 1973, however, I went to a volcano overlooking Clermont-Ferrand in central southern France. I went more to get a breath of fresh air than to take a drive in my car. My legs were itching after a full year following the races from circuit to circuit, almost always living on 4 wheels, so to speak. The air was cool at the time, and the sky rather grey with a background mist. I walked and jogged a little and left the path where my car was parked, aiming to reach the centre of the crater called Puy de la Solace, where I often went for picnics with my family in the summer. What a superb and breathtaking place it was, to think that thousands of years ago, right where my feet were standing, lava had spurted out at incredibly high temperatures. Decorative volcanic bombs can still be found among the debris. The stunted vegetation resembled that of Provence in France, but without the sunshine. I was just about to leave, and looked for the last time towards the top of the circular mountain, which was formed by an accumulation of volcanic slag. It reminded me how many times I had slid down those steep slopes as if I was on skis. Suddenly, in the fog, I saw a red light flashing. Then a sort of helicopter was descending towards me. A helicopter, however, makes a noise, but at that moment I could hear absolutely nothing, not even the slightest whistle. A balloon maybe. By now, the object was about 20 meters above the ground, and I could see it had a somewhat flattened shape. It was a flying saucer. I had always believed in their existence, but I had never dreamt I would actually see one. It measured some 7 meters in diameter, about 2.5 meters in height, was flat underneath and cone-shaped. On its underside, a very bright red light flashed, while at the top, an intermittent white light reminded me of a camera flash cube. This white light was so intense that I could not look at it without blinking. The object continued to descend without the slightest noise until it stopped and hovered motionless about 2 meters above the ground. I was petrified and remained absolutely still. I was not afraid, but rather filled with joy to be living through such a great moment. I bitterly regretted not having brought my camera with me. Then, the incredible happened. A trapdoor opened beneath the machine and a kind of stairway unfolded to the ground. I realized that some living being was about to appear, and I wondered what it was going to look like. First 2 feet appeared, then 2 legs, which reassured me a little since apparently I was about to meet a man. In the event, what at first I took to be a child came down the stairway and walked straight towards me. I could see then this was certainly no child, even though the figure was only about 4 feet, 1.2 meters tall. His eyes were slightly almond-shaped, his hair was black and long, and he had a small black beard. I still had not moved and he stopped about 10 meters away from me. He wore some sort of green one-piece suit, which covered his entire body, and although his head seemed to be exposed, I could see around it a strange sort of halo. It was not really a halo, but the air about his face shone slightly and shimmered. It looked like an invisible shield, like a bubble, so fine that you could barely see it. His skin was white with a slightly greenish tinge, a bit like someone with liver trouble. He smiled faintly, and I thought it best to return his smile. I felt rather ill at ease, so I smiled and bowed my head slightly in greeting. He answered with the same gesture. Thinking that I had to find out if he could hear me, I asked, "Where do you come from?" He answered in a strong, articulate voice that was slightly nasal, "From very far away." "Do you speak French?" I inquired. I speak all the languages of the earth. Do you come from another planet? Yes, he replied. As he spoke, he moved closer and stopped about 2 meters from me. Is this the first time you have visited the earth? Oh no. Have you been here often? Very often, to say the least. Why did you come here today? To talk to you. To me? Yes, to you, Claude Varian, editor of a small motorsport magazine, married and father of 2 children. How do you know all that? We've been watching you for a long time. Why me? This is precisely what I want to tell you. Why did you come here on this cold winter morning? I don't know. I felt like walking in the fresh air. Do you come here often? In the summer, yes, but almost never in this season. So, why did you come today? Had you planned this walk for a long time? No, I don't really know. When I woke up this morning, I suddenly had an urge to come here. You came because I wanted to see you. Do you believe in telepathy? Yes, of course. It's something I've always been interested in, as well as the subject of flying saucers, but I never thought I'd see one myself. Well, I used telepathy to get you to come here, because I have many things to tell you. Have you read the Bible? Yes, but why do you ask? Have you been reading it for a long time? No, as a matter of fact, I bought it only a few days ago. Why? I really don't know. Suddenly I had an urge to read it. Again, I used telepathy to make you decide to buy it. I have chosen you for a very difficult mission, and I have many things to tell you. So come into my craft where we can talk more comfortably. I followed him, climbing up the small staircase beneath the machine, which on closer inspection looked more like a flattened bell with a full and bulging underside. Inside it, 2 seats faced one another, and the temperature was mild even though the door was still open. There was no lamp, but natural light emanated from everywhere. There were no instruments like those you find in an aircraft cockpit. The floor was made of a sparkling alloy, which was slightly bluish. The chairs were colourless and translucent, but very comfortable, and made from one piece of material. I sat on the larger one that was set closer to the floor, so that the face of the little man sitting in front of me was at the same level as mine. He touched a spot on the wall, and the whole machine became transparent, except for its top and bottom. It was like being in the open air, but the temperature was mild. He invited me to take off my coat, which I did, and then he started to speak. You regret not having brought your camera so that you could have talked about our meeting to the whole world with proof in your hands. Yes, of course. Listen to me carefully. You will tell human beings about this meeting, but you will tell them the truth about what they are and about what we are. Judging from their reactions, we will know if we can show ourselves freely and officially. Wait until you know everything before you start speaking publicly. Then you will be able to defend yourself properly against those people who will not believe you, and you will be able to bring them incontestable proof. You will write down everything I tell you and publish the writings in a book. But why did you choose me? For many reasons. First of all, we needed someone in a country where new ideas are welcomed, and where it is possible to talk about such ideas openly. Democracy was born in France, and this country has a reputation the world over for being the country of freedom. Also, we needed someone who is intelligent and quite open to everything. Above all, we needed someone who is a free thinker without being anti-religious. Because you were born of a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, we consider you to be an ideal link between 2 very important peoples in the history of the world. Besides, your activities do not in any way predispose you to making incredible revelations, and this will make your words all the more believable. Since you are not a scientist, you will not complicate things and will explain them simply. Not being a literary man, you won't compose elaborate sentences, which are difficult to read for a great many people. Finally, we decided to choose someone who was born after the first atomic explosion in 1945, and you were born in 1946. We have in fact been following you since your birth, and even before. This is why we have chosen you. Do you have any other questions? Where do you come from? From a distant planet, about which I will tell you nothing for fear that men of the earth might be unwise enough to disturb our peace. Is your planet very far away? Very far. When I tell you the distance, you will understand that it is impossible to reach it with your present level of scientific and technical knowledge. What are you called? We are people like you, and we live on a planet similar to Earth. How long does it take you to come here? As long as it takes to think about it. Why do you come to Earth? To monitor and watch over the development of humanity. Human beings on Earth are the future. We are the past. Are there many people on your planet? There are more people than on yours. I would like to visit your planet, can I? No. First of all, you couldn't live there because the atmosphere is different from yours, and you have not been trained for such a journey. But why meet here? Because the crater of a volcano is an ideal place away from irksome people. I shall leave you now. Come back tomorrow at the same time with the Bible and something to take notes with. Do not bring any metallic objects and speak to no one of our conversation. Otherwise, we will never meet again. He handed me my coat, let me climb down the ladder and waved his hand. The ladder folded up and the door closed without a sound. Still without making the slightest murmur or any whistling sound, the craft rose gently to a height of about 400 meters, then disappeared into the mist.
Chapter 2. The Truth. Genesis.
The following day, I was at the meeting place again as arranged with a notebook, a pen and the Bible. The flying machine reappeared on time, and I found myself face to face once more with the little man, who invited me to enter the machine and sit in the same comfortable chair. I'd spoken to nobody about all this, not even to my closest friends, and he was happy to learn that I'd been discreet. He suggested I take notes, and then he started to speak. A very long time ago on our distant planet, we had reached a level of technical and scientific knowledge comparable to that which you will soon reach. Our scientists had started to create primitive embryonic forms of life, namely living cells in test tubes. Everyone was thrilled by this. The scientists perfected their techniques and began creating bizarre little animals, but the government, under pressure from public opinion, ordered the scientists to stop their experiments for fear they would create monsters which would become dangerous to society. In fact, one of these animals had broken loose and killed several people. Since at that time, interplanetary and intergalactic explorations had also made progress, the scientists decided to set out for a distant planet where they could find most of the necessary conditions to pursue their experiments. They chose Earth, where you live. Now, I would like you to refer to the Bible, where you will find traces of the truth about your past. These traces, of course, have been somewhat distorted by successive transcribers who could not conceive of such high technology and could therefore only explain what was described as being a mystical and supernatural force. Only the parts of the Bible that I will translate are important. Other parts are merely poetic babblings of which I will say nothing. I'm sure you can appreciate that, thanks to the law which said that the Bible had always to be recopied without changing even the smallest detail. The deepest meaning has remained intact throughout the ages, even if the text has been larded with mystical and futile sentences. So, let us start with the first chapter of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, Elohim created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1, verse 1. Elohim, translated without justification in some Bibles by the word God, means in Hebrew, those who came from the sky. And furthermore, the word is a plural. It means that the scientists from our world searched for a planet that was suitable to carry out their projects. They created, or in reality discovered the Earth, and realized it contained all the necessary elements for the creation of artificial life, even if its atmosphere was not quite the same as our own. And the spirit of Elohim moved across the waters. Genesis 1, verse 2. This means the scientists made reconnaissance flights, and what you might call artificial satellites were placed around the Earth to study its constitution and atmosphere. The Elohim saw that the light was good. Genesis 1, verse 4. To create life on Earth, it was important to know whether the sun was sending harmful rays to the Earth's surface, and this question was fully researched. It turned out that the sun was heating the Earth correctly, without sending out harmful rays. In other words, the light was good. There was a night and there was a morning, the first day. Genesis 1, verse 5. This research took quite some time. The day mentioned here corresponds to the period in which your sun rises under the same sign on the day of the vernal equinox. In other words, about 2,000 years on Earth. He divided the waters under the heavens from the waters above the firmament. Genesis 1, verse 7. After studying the cosmic rays above the clouds, The scientists descended below the clouds but stayed above the waters. That means they were between the clouds, the waters above the firmament, and the ocean covering the whole planet, the waters under the heavens. Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. Genesis 1, verse 9. After they studied the surface of the ocean, they studied the seabed and determined that it was not very deep and fairly even everywhere. So then, by means of fairly strong explosions, which acted rather like bulldozers, they raised matter from the bottom of the seas and piled it up into one place to form a continent. Originally, there was on Earth only one continent, and your scientists have recently acknowledged that all the continents, which have drifted apart over many years, used to fit perfectly into one another to form one landmass. Let the earth grow vegetation, grass and trees which have in them their own seed according to their species. Genesis 1 verse 11. In this magnificent and gigantic laboratory, they created vegetable cells from nothing other than chemicals, which then produced various types of plants. All their efforts were aimed at reproduction. The few blades of grass they created had to reproduce on their own. The scientists spread out across this immense continent in small research teams. Every individual created different varieties of plants according to their inspiration and the climate. They met up at regular intervals to compare their research and their creations. The people back on their own planet followed their progress from afar with passion and amazement. The most brilliant artists came and joined the scientists in order to give some plants purely decorative and pleasing roles, either through their appearance or their perfume. Let there be lights in the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be used as signs for the seasons, for the days and for the years. Genesis 1 verse 14. By observing the stars and the sun, they could measure the duration of the days, the months, and the years on Earth. This helped them regulate their life on the new planet, so different from their own, where days and years did not have the same duration. Research in astronomy enabled them to locate themselves precisely and to understand the Earth better. Let the waters teem with an abundance of living animals, and let the birds fly above the earth. Genesis 1, verse 20. Next, they created the first aquatic animals, from plankton to small fish, then very large fish. They also created seaweed to balance this little world, so that the small fish could feed on it and the bigger fish could eat the small fish in turn. Thus, a natural balance would be established, and one species would not destroy another species in order to survive. This is what you now refer to as ecology, and that was achieved successfully. The scientists and artists met often and organized competitions to determine which team had created the most beautiful or most interesting animals. After the fish, they created birds. This was done under pressure, it must be said, from the artists, who went out of their way to create the most stunning forms with the craziest colors. Some of them had great trouble flying because their beautiful feathers were very cumbersome. The contests went even further, embracing not only physical characteristics, but also the behavior of these animals, particularly the wonderful dances of their mating rituals. Some other groups of scientists created frightful animals, veritable monsters, which proved right those people who had opposed the creation plans on their own planet. These were dragons, or what you call dinosaurs and brontosaurs. Let the living animals emerge from the earth according to their species, livestock, reptiles and wild animals, according to their species. Genesis 1 verse 24. After marine organisms and birds, the scientists created land animals on a planet where the vegetation had by now become magnificent. There was plenty of food for the herbivores. These were the first land animals which were created. Later, they created carnivores to balance the herbivorous population. Here too the species had to maintain equilibrium. Those scientists who did all this came from the same planet as me. I am one of those people who created life on Earth. It was at that time that the most skillful among us wanted to create an artificial human being like ourselves. Each team set to work, and very soon we were able to compare our creations. But on our home planet, people were outraged when they heard that we were making test tube children who might come to threaten their world. They feared that these new human beings could become a danger if their mental capacities or powers turned out to be superior to those of their creators. So we had to agree to leave the new humans to live in a very primitive way, without letting them know anything scientific, and we made our own actions mystifying to them. It is easy to work out how many teams of creators did this. Each race on Earth corresponds to a team of creators. Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness. Let them have authority over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock, over all wild animals, and over all the reptiles which crawl on the earth. Genesis 1 verse 26. In our image. You can see that the resemblance is striking. That is when the trouble started for us. The team located in the country you now call Israel, which at the time was not far from Greece and Turkey on the original continent, was composed of brilliant creators who were perhaps the most talented team of all. Their animals were the most beautiful, and their plants had the sweetest perfumes. This was what you call paradise on earth. The human beings they created there were the most intelligent, so steps had to be taken to ensure that they did not surpass their creators. The created, therefore, had to be kept in ignorance of the great scientific secrets, while being educated for the purpose of measuring their intelligence. Of every tree in the garden you may eat, but of the tree of good and evil you shall not eat of it. For on the day that you eat of it, you shall die. Genesis 2 verse 17. This means you, the created, can learn all you want, read all of the books we have here at your disposal, but never touch the scientific books, otherwise you will die. He brought to man all the animals to see what he would call them. Genesis 2 verse 19. Human beings had to have a thorough understanding of the plants and animals around them, their way of life, and the way to get food from them. The creators taught them the names and the powers of everything that existed around them, since botany and zoology were not considered dangerous for them. Imagine the joy of this team of scientists having 2 children, a male and a female, running around eagerly learning what was being taught to them. The serpent said to the woman, "Of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, you would not die, for Elohim know that on the day you eat thereof your eyes will be opened and you shall be as gods." Genesis 3 verse 1 through 5. Some scientists in this team felt a deep love for their little human beings, their creatures, and they wanted to give them a complete education in order to make them scientists like themselves. So they told these young people who were almost adults that they could pursue their scientific studies, and in so doing, they would become as knowledgeable as their creators. Then the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Genesis 3 verse 7. The new human beings then understood that they could also become creators in their turn, and they became angry at their parents for having kept them away from scientific books, considering them to be like dangerous laboratory animals. Yahweh Elohim said to the serpent, "Be damned, on your belly you shall crawl, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life." Genesis 3 verse 14. The serpent was this small group of creators who had wished to tell the truth to Adam and Eve, and as a result they were condemned by the government of their own planet to live in exile on Earth, while all the other scientists had to put a stop to their experiments and leave the Earth. Elohim made for the man and his wife coats of skin and clothed them. Genesis 3 verse 21. The creators gave their creation the basic means of survival, enough to manage without needing any further contact with them. The Bible has preserved a sentence which is close to the original document. Now that man has become one of us, thanks to science, now we must ensure that he does not put out his hand and take from the tree of life, eat, and live forever. Genesis 3, verse 22. Human life is very short, but there is a scientific way to prolong it. Human scientists who study all their lives can only begin to amass sufficient knowledge to start making interesting discoveries when they get old, which is the reason why human progress is so slow. If humans could live 10 times longer, scientific knowledge would take a gigantic leap forward. If, when they were first created, these new beings could have lived much longer, they would have quite rapidly become our equals, because their mental faculties are slightly superior to our own. They are unaware of their full potential. This applies especially to the people of Israel, who, as I mentioned earlier, had been selected in a contest as the most successful type of humanoid on Earth due to their intelligence and genius. This explains why they have always considered themselves to be the chosen people. In truth, they were the people chosen by the teams of scientists who gathered together to judge their creations. You can see for yourself the number of geniuses born out of that race. So he drove out man and placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and a flaming sword, which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Genesis 3 verse 24. Soldiers, with atomic disintegration weapons were placed at the entrance to the Creator's residence to prevent human beings from stealing more scientific knowledge.
The Flood.
Let us move on to the 4th chapter of Genesis. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground to Elohim, and Abel also brought the firstlings of his flock. Genesis 4, verses 3 through 4. The creators in exile, who were left under military surveillance, urged the human beings to bring them food in order to show their own superiors that the newly created people were good, and that they would never turn against their creators. Thus, they managed to obtain permission for the leaders of these first human beings to benefit from the tree of life, and this explains how they lived so long. Adam lived for 930 years, Seth for 912 years, and Enos for 905 years, and so on, as is stated in Genesis chapter 5 verses 1 through 11. When man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of Elohim saw the daughters of men were beautiful. They took them as wives of all they had chosen. Genesis 6 verse 2. The creators living in exile took the most beautiful daughters of humanity and made them their wives. My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Genesis 6 verse 3. Longevity is not hereditary, and much to the relief of the authorities on the distant planet, the children of the new human beings did not automatically benefit from the tree of life. Thus the secret of life was lost, and mankind's progress was slowed down. When the sons of Elohim came into the daughters of men, and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Genesis 6 verse 4. There you have proof that the creators could have intercourse with the daughters of humanity, whom they had created in their own image, and in so doing produced exceptional children. These actions seemed very dangerous to people on the distant planet. The scientific progress on Earth was fantastic, and they decided to destroy what had been created. And Yahweh saw that man had done much evil on Earth, and that his thoughts and inclinations were always evil. Genesis 6 verse 5. The evil in question was the desire of human beings to become scientific and independent people equal to their creators. Being good, as far as those on the Elohim's planet were concerned, meant the new human beings would remain primitive, vegetating on the earth. Their evil was the wish to progress, perhaps enabling them one day to catch up with their creators. The government then decided from their distant planet to destroy all life on Earth by sending nuclear missiles. However, when the exiled creators were informed of the project, they asked Noah to build a spaceship which would orbit the Earth during the cataclysm, containing a pair of each species that was to be preserved. This was true, figuratively speaking, but in reality, and your scientific knowledge will very soon enable you to understand this, a single living cell of each species, male and female, is all that is required to recreate a whole being. This is something like the first living cell of a fetus in the womb of its mother, which already possesses all the information needed to create a human being, right down to the colour of its eyes and hair. This was a colossal task, but it was completed on time. When the explosion took place, life had already been preserved a few thousand kilometres above the Earth. The continent was submerged by a gigantic tidal wave, which destroyed all forms of life on its surface. The ark was lifted above the Earth, Genesis 7 verse 17. As you can clearly see, it is said that the ark was lifted above the earth and not on the water. Then it was necessary to wait until there was no more dangerous radioactive fallout. The waters grew above the earth during 150 days, Genesis 7 verse 24. The spacecraft had 3 sections. You shall build it in stages, the lower, the second, and the third, Genesis 6 verse 16. Later, it landed on Earth, and besides Noah, it carried a couple from each race of human beings on the earth. Elohim remembered Noah. A wind blew across the earth and the waters became still. Genesis 8 verse 1. After monitoring the level of radioactivity and dispersing it scientifically, the creators told Noah to release the animals to see if they could survive in the atmosphere. This operation was successful and they were able to venture out into the open air. The creators then asked the human survivors to work and multiply, and show their gratitude to their benefactors who had created them and saved them from destruction. Noah agreed to give a portion of their harvest and their cattle to the creators to ensure they survived. Noah built an altar for Elohim and took all the pure beasts and all the pure birds, and he made an offering on the altar. Genesis 8 verse 20. The creators were happy to see that humans wished them well, and they promised never to try to destroy their creation again. They understood that it was only normal for them to want to progress scientifically. Every inclination of man's heart is evil. Genesis 8 verse 21. Each race of humanity was then returned to its original place of creation, and each animal was recreated from the cells which had been preserved aboard the ark. From them came the separated nations on earth after the flood. Genesis 10 verse 32.
The Tower of Babel.
But the most intelligent race, the people of Israel, was making such remarkable progress that they were soon able to undertake the conquest of space with the help of the exiled creators. The latter wanted their new human beings to go to the creator's planet to obtain their pardon by showing that they were not only intelligent and scientific, but also grateful and peaceful. So they built an enormous rocket, the Tower of Babel. And now they have decided to do this. Henceforward nothing they plan to do will be beyond their reach. Genesis 11 verse 6. The people on our planet became frightened when they heard about this. They were still observing the Earth and knew that life had not been destroyed. Let us go down there and confuse their speech, so that they will not understand what they say to one another. So Yahweh scattered them from there all over the earth. Genesis 11 verse 7. So they came and took the Jews who had the most scientific knowledge and scattered them all over the continent among primitive tribes in countries where nobody could understand them because the language was different, and they destroyed all their scientific instruments.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
The exiled creators were pardoned and allowed to return to their original planet, where they pleaded the case of their magnificent creation. As a result, everyone on the distant planet fixed their eyes on the earth because it was inhabited by people they had themselves created. But among the humans who had been dispersed on earth, a few nursed a desire for vengeance. So they gathered in the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, and having managed to salvage a few scientific secrets, they prepared an expedition aimed at punishing those who had tried to destroy them. Consequently, the creators sent 2 spies to investigate what was going on. And there came 2 angels to Sodom in the evening. Genesis 19 verse 1. Some humans tried to kill them, but the spies managed to blind their attackers with a pocket atomic weapon. And they smote them with blindness, both small and great. Genesis 19 verse 11. They warned those who were peaceful to leave the town because they were going to destroy it with an atomic explosion. Leave this place, for Yahweh is going to destroy the city. Genesis 19 verse 14. As the people were leaving town, they were in no particular hurry because they did not realize what an atomic explosion could mean. Flee for your lives. Do not look back and do not stop anywhere. Genesis 19 verse 17. And the bomb fell on Sodom and Gomorrah. Then Yahweh rained down fire and brimstone from the skies of Sodom and Gomorrah. He overthrew those cities and destroyed all the plain, and all inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19, verse 24 through 26. As you now know, burns caused by an atomic explosion kill those who are too near and make them look like salt statues.
The Sacrifice of Abraham.
Later, after most of their leading intellectuals had been destroyed and they had relapsed into a semi-primitive state, the creators wished to see if the people of Israel, and particularly their leader, still had positive feelings towards them. This is related in the paragraph where Abraham wants to sacrifice his own son. The creators tested him to see if his feelings towards them were sufficiently strong. Fortunately, the experiment ended positively. Do not raise your hand against the boy. Do not touch him. Now I know that you fear Elohim. Genesis 22, verse 12. There you have it. Assimilate it all and write down everything that I've just told you. I will tell you more tomorrow. Once again the small man took leave of me, and his spacecraft rose slowly into the air. Because the sky was clearer this time, I was able to watch more closely as it took off. It hovered motionless at a height of about 400 meters. Then, still without the slightest sound, the vessel turned red as if it were heating up, then as white-hot metal, and then finally a sort of bluish purple like an enormous spark, which was impossible to look at. Then it disappeared completely.
Chapter 3. Watching over the chosen people. Moses.
The next day, I again met with my visitor, and he immediately continued his story. In Genesis, chapter 28, there is another description of our presence. A ladder which rested upon the ground, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of Elohim were going up and down upon it. Genesis 28, verse 12. Because of the destruction of centers of progress such as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the elimination of the most intelligent individuals, human beings had lapsed back into a primitive state and had begun, rather stupidly, to adore pieces of stone and idols, forgetting those who had really created them. Put away the strange gods that are among you. Genesis 35, verse 2. In Exodus, we appeared to Moses, and the angel of Yahweh appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Exodus 3, verse 2. A rocket landed in front of him, and his description corresponds to what a Brazilian tribesman might say today, if we were to land before him in a flying vessel, illuminating the trees without burning them. The people chosen as the most intelligent had lost their most brilliant minds, and had become slaves to neighboring tribes who were more numerous since they had not undergone the same destruction. It was thus necessary to restore dignity to the people of Israel by returning their land to them. The beginning of Exodus describes all that we had to do to help liberate the people of Israel. Once freed, we guided them to the country which we had destined for them. And Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire, to give them light to go by day and night. Exodus 13, verse 21. In order to slow down the march of the Egyptians who had started to pursue them. The pillar of the cloud went before their face and stood behind them, and it was a cloud and darkness to one side, but it gave light by night to the other. Exodus 14, verse 19 through 20. The smoke emitted behind the people of Israel made a curtain, which slowed down their pursuers. Then the crossing of the water was made possible by a repulsion beam, which cleared a passageway, and made the sea dry land, and the waters divided. Thus Yahweh saved Israel. Exodus 14, verses 21 and 30. While they were crossing the desert, the chosen people began to feel hungry. Upon the face of the wilderness, fine flakes appeared, fine hoarfrost on the ground. Exodus 16, verse 14. The manna was nothing more than pulverized synthetic chemical food, which, when spread on the ground, swelled with the early morning dew. As for the staff which allowed Moses to draw water from the rock, as it says in Exodus 17, verse 6, it was nothing but a detector of underground water pools, similar to those which you use at present to find oil, for example. Once the water is located, one has only to dig. Then in chapter 20 of Exodus, a certain number of rules are cited. Because the Israelites were so primitive, they needed laws regarding morals and especially hygiene. These were outlined in the commandments. The creators came to dictate these laws to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they arrived in a flying vessel. There were thunders and lightning, and thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of a trumpet exceedingly loud. And Mount Sinai was altogether in smoke, because Yahweh descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly, and the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder. Exodus 19, verses 16 through 19. The creators were afraid of being invaded or maltreated by human beings. It was therefore essential that they be respected, even venerated, so that they would be in no danger. The people cannot come up Mount Sinai, but let not the priests and the people break through to come unto Yahweh, for fear that he may break out against them. Exodus 19, verse 23 through 24. Also it was written, And Moses alone shall come near Yahweh, but the elders of Israel and the people may not go up with him at all. Exodus 24 verse 2. They saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was, as it were, a pavement of sapphire, clear blue as the heavens. Exodus 24 verse 10. There you have the description of the pedestal upon which one of the creators presented himself, and it was made of the same bluish alloy as the floor of the machine in which we are now sitting. And the sight of the glory of Yahweh was like the devouring fire on the top of the mount. Exodus 24 verse 17. Here you have a description of the glory, in reality the flying vessel, and as you have already noticed, upon takeoff it has a coloration similar to fire. This team of creators was going to live on earth for some time, and they wished to eat fresh food. That is why they asked the Israelites to bring them fresh provisions regularly, and also riches which they wanted to take back to their own planet. I suppose you might call it colonization. You shall accept whatever contribution each man shall freely offer. This is what you shall accept: gold, silver, copper, violet, purple and scarlet yard. Exodus 25 verse 2 through 4. They also decided they would like to live more comfortably, so they asked the human beings to build them a residence according to plans they had drawn up. The plans are described in chapter 26 of the book of Exodus. In this residence, they would meet the representatives of the people. It was a meeting place where people brought food and gifts as a pledge of submission. He entered the tent of the meeting place. When Moses entered it, the pillar of cloud came down and stayed at the entrance to the tent while Yahweh spoke with Moses. And Yahweh would speak to Moses face to face, as one man speaks to another. Exodus 33 verses 8 through 11. Just as today I can speak to you as you can speak to me, man to man. My face you cannot see, for no man may see me and live. Exodus 33 verse 20. There you have a reference to the difference in atmosphere between our planets. Humans cannot see their creators unless the latter are protected by a pressurized suit, because the terrestrial atmosphere is not suitable for them. If you came to our planet, you would see the creators without a spacesuit, but you would die because the atmosphere is not suitable for you. The entire beginning of Leviticus explains how the food offered to the creators had to be brought to them. For example, in Leviticus 21 verse 17, it says, "No man among your descendants for all time who has any physical defect shall come to present food to his God." This is obviously to prevent sick or deformed people, who were symbols of failure and therefore unbearable to the eyes of the creators, from presenting themselves before them. In the book of Numbers 11 verses 7 through 8, there is a very precise description of the manna which your chemists could very easily produce. And the manna looked like coriander seed, the colour of gum resin. The taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. This manna was nothing more than a chemical food, but the creators preferred fresh fruits and vegetables. They will bring unto Yahweh the first ripe fruits of all produce in their land. Numbers 18 verse 13. Later, the creators taught human beings how to inject themselves to treat snake bites. Make a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole so that anyone bitten could look at it and live. Numbers 21 verse 8. As soon as someone was bitten, he looked at the serpent of brass. That is to say, a syringe was brought to him so that he could be injected with serum. Finally, the journey which led the chosen people to the promised land came to an end. Following the advice of the creators, they destroyed the idols of the local primitive people and took over their territories. You will destroy all their melted metal statues, and you will possess the country. Numbers 33, verses 52 through 53. The chosen people finally reached their promised land. Because he loved your fathers, he has chosen your race after them. Deuteronomy 4, verse 3 and 7. In the book of Joshua, chapter 3, verse 15, we read about the crossing of the Jordan. When the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, the water coming down from upstream was brought to a standstill. It piled up like a bank for a long way back. The waters were completely cut off and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Thus the creators helped the chosen people cross without getting their feet wet, just as they had done in their escape from the Egyptians, by using the same water repulsion ray.
The trumpets of Jericho.
At the end of chapter 5 in the book of Joshua, there is a meeting between a military creator and the chosen people regarding the resistance of the city of Jericho. I am here as captain of the army of Yahweh. Joshua 5 verse 14. A military consultant was sent to the Jewish people to assist them in the siege of Jericho. It is easy to understand how the walls were knocked down. You know that the very high voice of a singer can crack a crystal glass. By using highly amplified supersonic waves, one can knock down a brick wall. This is what was done, using a very complicated instrument which the Bible calls a trumpet. When they make a long blast with a ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, the walls of the city shall fall down flat. Joshua 6 verse 5. At a given moment, the supersonic waves were emitted in a synchronized way, and the walls fell down. A little later, some real bombing took place. Yahweh hurled great hailstones at them out of the sky, and more died from the hailstones than the Israelites slew by the sword. Joshua 10 verse 11. This full-scale bombing, as indicated, killed more people than the swords of the Israelites. One of the most misunderstood passages is in Joshua chapter 10 verse 13, where it is stated, "So the sun stood still, and the moon halted until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies." This simply means that it was a flash war, which lasted only one day. In fact, it is stated later that the war occupied nearly a whole day. It was so short when you consider the extent of the lands conquered, that people thought the sun had stood still. In the book of Judges, chapter 6, verse 21, one of the creators is again in contact with a man called Gideon, who continues to supply him with food. The angel of Yahweh put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And there rose up fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of Yahweh departed out of his sight. The creators were unable to eat in the open air because of their pressurized suits, but if necessary, using a scientific technique, they could feed themselves by extracting the essentials from these offerings using a flexible tube or cane. The process radiates flames, which made people at the time think sacrifices to God were being made. In chapter 7 of the book of Judges, 300 men with trumpets surrounded the enemy camp, and using amplified supersonic instruments, they blew them simultaneously in order to drive all the people in the camp mad. You now know that certain high-pitched sounds carried to extremes can drive anyone mad. Indeed, the soldiers who had been surrounded went wild, fought amongst themselves, and ran away.
Samson, the telepathist.
In Judges chapter 13, there is yet another example of mating taking place between the creators and human women. And the angel of Yahweh appeared unto the woman and said, "You are barren and have no child, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son." Judges 13, verse 3. It was necessary that the fruit of this union be healthy, so that the behavior of the child could be studied. This is why he tells her, "And drink not the wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarene, consecrated unto God from the womb." Judges 13, verse 4 through 5. Later it is written, "And the angel of Elohim came again to the woman who was sitting in the fields. Her husband was not with her." Judges 13, verse 9. It is easy to imagine what happened during her husband's absence. It was an easy task for the scientists to cure her sterility. In this way, she was made aware that she was going to give birth to an exceptional individual, and that she should take the utmost care of her baby. It was wonderful for the creators to mate with the daughters of humanity. This enabled them to have sons ruling directly on earth, where the atmosphere was not suitable for themselves. The point about not shaving off any hair is very important. The human brain is like a huge transmitter, capable of sending out a multitude of very accurate waves and thoughts. In fact, telepathy is nothing more than that. But this type of transmitter requires antennae, and the hair and beard are these antennae. That is why you should not shave off any hair if you want to make use of your transmitters. You have surely noticed that many of your scientists have long hair, and often a beard. Prophets and other wise people have them too. Now you can understand why. The child was born. It was Samson, whose story you know. He was able to communicate directly with God by telepathy, thanks to his natural antenna, his hair, and the creators could then help him during difficult moments and produce marvels to reinforce his authority. But when Delilah cut his hair, he could no longer ask for help. Then his eyes were gouged out by his enemies. But when his hair grew again, he regained his strength. That is to say, he could once again ask for help from the creators, who then demolished the temple where he was touching the columns. All of this was attributed to Samson's strength. In Samuel chapter 3, we find Elisha initiating Samuel into telepathy. The creators wanted to contact Samuel, and he thinks that Elisha is speaking to him. He hears voices. "Go lie down, and it shall be. If he calls thee, that thou shalt say, Speak, Yahweh, for thy servant heareth." 1 Samuel 3, verse 9. This is a little like the behavior of amateur radio operators, who might say, "Go ahead, I can hear you loud and clear," and the telepathic conversation begins. "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel answered, "Speak, for thy servant heareth." 1 Samuel 3, verse 10 through 11. In the episode where David challenges Goliath, there is quite an interesting sentence which ends, "that he should defy the armies of the living God." 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. This shows the reality of the presence in that epoch of a quite tangible God. Telepathy as a means of communication between the creators and human beings was only possible when the Elohim were in proximity to the earth. When they were on their distant planet or elsewhere, they could not communicate in this way. For this reason, they set up a transmitter-receiver which was transported in the Ark of God, an apparatus containing its own atomic-powered cell. This is why in the first book of Samuel, chapter 5 and 6, when the Philistines stole the Ark, their idol Dagon lay face down on the ground nearby as the result of an electrical discharge caused by their clumsy mishandling of it. They also suffered radiation burns from the dangerous radioactive materials, and he afflicted them with tumors. 1 Samuel 5, verse 6. Even the Hebrew people, who had not taken precautions while handling the ark, were harmed. The oxen stumbled, and Huzzah reached out to the ark of God and took hold of it. Yahweh was angry with Huzzah and struck him down for his rash act, so he died there beside the ark of God. 2 Samuel 6, verses 6 through 7. The ark almost fell over, and Huzzah, trying to hold it up, touched a dangerous part of the machine and was electrocuted. In the first book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 50 and 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 28, we read in several places of individuals who caught hold of the horns of the altar. This refers to the manipulation of the transmitter-receiver levers, which was necessary when trying to communicate with the creators.
The first residence to welcome the Elohim.
The great King Solomon built a sumptuous residence in order to welcome the creators when they came to visit the earth. Yahweh said he resides in a cloud. I truly constructed a house for you. 1 Kings 8, verse 12 through 13. The glory of Yahweh has filled the house of Yahweh. 1 Kings 8, verse 11. The cloud filled the house of Yahweh. 1 Kings 8, verse 10. I shall reside among the sons of Israel. 1 Kings 6, verse 13. So the creators lived in a cloud, or rather in a vessel that orbits above the clouds. Imagine trying to make primitive people understand that. A man of God sent by Yahweh came from Judah to Bethel. He said, "The altar will be split apart." Jeroboam stretched his hand from the altar and said, "Seize him." But the hand he stretched out shriveled up so he could not pull it back, and the altar split apart. 1 Kings 13, verse 1 through 5. With the help of an atomic disintegrator, one of the creators destroyed the altar and burned the hand of the man who did not show respect for the creators. He returns to one of the Elohim's terrestrial camps by another route, to keep their whereabouts secret. Do not return again by the same way that thou camest. So he went by another way. 1 Kings 13, verse 10. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 6, there is an example of the radio control of animals through the use of electrodes, as you yourselves are beginning to discover. And the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening. At this time, following some of their own new discoveries, the creators decided to appear less frequently. They wanted to give human beings the opportunity to develop by themselves in order to see if they would reach the age of scientific knowledge unaided. So the creators began to use increasingly discreet means of communicating with humans, as in the method of feeding Elijah using homing ravens. This was the beginning of a gigantic experiment throughout the galaxy, in which several humanities are in competition. The creators decided to appear less often, while at the same time reinforcing the authority and reputation of their ambassadors, the prophets, by using miracles. That is to say, scientific means which were then incomprehensible to the people of that era. Look, your son is alive. Now by this I know that thou art a man of God. 1 Kings 17, verse 23 through 24. Elisha had healed a young child who was dying. Later, he ordered 2 bull calves to be placed on logs at Mount Carmel, one to be consecrated to the idol Baal and the other to the creators. The one that would ignite by itself would represent the one true God. Obviously, at a moment agreed upon in advance between Elijah and the creators, the Elohim's chosen log burst into flames, even though the wood was wet. This was accomplished by a powerful beam similar to a laser, emitted from a vessel hidden in the clouds. Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the whole offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. 1 Kings 18, verse 38.
Elijah, the messenger.
The creators paid particular attention to Elijah. An angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." At his bedside was a pancake and a jar of water. All this happened in the desert. 1 Kings 19, verse 5 through 6. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke the rocks in front of Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. 1 Kings 19, verse 11 through 12. There you have the exact description of a landing by a machine similar to one of your rockets. Then, further on, a vision of the creators is described. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the army of heaven standing by him. 1 Kings 22, verse 19. The creators once again used telepathy, this time group telepathy, so that none of the prophets could predict the truth to the king. I will be a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets. 1 Kings, chapter 22, verse 22. In the second book of Kings, there is further evidence of the protection which the creators gave to Elijah. If I am a man of God, may fire fall from heaven and consume you and your company. Fire fell from heaven and consumed the officer and his 50 men. 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 12. This operation happened again, but the third time the angel of Yahweh said unto Elijah, Go down with him and be not afraid of him. 2 Kings 1, verse 15. In the second book of Kings, chapter 2, Elijah is invited into a spacecraft which takes off with him on board. When Yahweh would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2, verse 1. Also, later it adds, There appeared a chariot of fire and a horse of fire, which parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. 2 Kings 2, verse 11. This is a clear description of a spacecraft taking off, and when the narrator speaks of horses of fire, he is referring to the fire and the smoke which were emitted from the blast pipes. If you showed certain South American or African tribespeople a rocket taking off, they would be incapable of understanding this scientific phenomena in a rational way, and would look upon it as something supernatural, mystical and divine. When returning to their tribes, they would speak of fire horses and chariots. Further on in the second book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 32 through 37, Elisha, like his father, performs a resurrection. He heals and brings back to life a child who was dead. This happens quite frequently nowadays, when mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and heart massage revives a person whose cardiac muscle has ceased to function. Then Elisha proceeds to multiply the bread.
The multiplication of bread.
A man brought the man of God 20 barley loaves, but his servant said, How can I feed 100 people with 20 loaves? Elisha said, They will eat, and there will be some left over. So he set it before them, and they ate and left some over, as Yahweh had said. 2 Kings 4, verses 42 through 44. The creators had brought synthetic dehydrated food with them, which, when added to water, increased to 5 times its original volume. So, with 20 small loaves of bread, there was enough food for 100 people. You are already familiar with the little vitamin pills which nourished your first astronauts. They take up very little space but contain all the necessary nutritional elements. 1 pill is enough to feed 1 person. A quantity equivalent in volume to 1 small loaf of bread is enough to feed 5 people. Therefore, 20 loaves are sufficient to feed 100 people. But the people of Israel had begun adoring metal idols. They had also become cannibals and were completely immoral, much to the disgust of their creators. So was Israel carried away out of their lands. 2 Kings 17, verse 23. That was the beginning of the dispersion of the Israelites, whose civilization, instead of making progress, was constantly regressing, in contrast to their neighbors who took advantage of their opportunities. In the book of Isaiah, you again find, "In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted. Above him stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. 1 pair covered their faces, 1 pair their feet, and 1 pair was spread in flight." Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 2. That is a description of the creators dressed in their one-piece spacesuits, fitted with 6 small jet engines, 2 on their backs, 2 on their arms, and 2 on their feet, all for steering purposes. Listen, a noise on the mountains like that of a great multitude, an uproar among kingdoms like nations amassing together. Yahweh is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of heaven. Yahweh and his instruments of wrath to destroy the land. Isaiah 13, verses 4 through 50. The whole truth is encapsulated in that quote. It is just a matter of reading between the lines in order to understand. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of heaven. That could not be clearer. You thought in your own mind, "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God." Isaiah 14, verse 13. This refers to the human scientists who had accumulated sufficient knowledge to undertake a trip to the Creator's planet, but were destroyed at Sodom and Gomorrah. The army of the heavens is described here at that time, when they arrived with the weapons of wrath to destroy the whole country. It was those human scientists of Sodom and Gomorrah who said, "I will rise above the cloud banks and will equal myself to the Most High." Isaiah 14, verse 14. But the destruction prevented humans from equaling their creators, the Most High. He made the world a wilderness. Isaiah 14, verse 17. The nuclear explosion is described further on. "For a cry is gone around the border of Moab, the howling thereof unto Eglaim, and unto the well of Beeralim, for the waters of Dimon are filled with blood." Isaiah 15, verse 8 through 9. A few were saved because they sheltered in bunkers. "Go, my people, enter your rooms and shut your doors behind you. Withdraw a brief while until the wrath has gone by." Isaiah 26, verse 20.
The flying saucers of Ezekiel.
It is in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, beginning at verse 4, that we find the most interesting description of one of our flying machines. "I looked and saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each one had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread upwards. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes, all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse their wings were stretched out one towards the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above, on the throne, was the figure like that of a man. Ezekiel 1, verse 1 through 26. There you have a description which could not be more precise of the landing of the creators in their flying machines. The windstorm is the trace of smoke or vapor trail that present-day planes leave behind them at high altitudes. Then the machine appeared with its blinking light, the flashing lightning, and glowing metal. Later, 4 creatures appeared wearing anti-gravity suits with small directional jet engines attached. These are described as the wings on their metal suits, and their feet gleamed like burnished bronze. You have surely noticed how shiny the suits of your astronauts are. As for the flying saucers, or wheels, their appearance and their operation were not at all badly described, considering it is a primitive person who is speaking. As it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel, they turned not when they went. In the center of the flying saucer, very similar to the one in which we are now sitting, was the habitable section, the rim. All 4 rims were full of eyes all around. In the same way that our clothing has evolved, we no longer wear those cumbersome spacesuits. Our vessels then had portholes, the eyes around the rims, because we had not then discovered how to see through metallic walls by modifying their atomic structure at will. The flying saucers stayed near the creators ready to help them if the need arose, since they were loading supplies and carrying out routine maintenance on the large intergalactic vessel above them. Other creators inside the vessels were directing them. The spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. This is quite clear. The suit described with its 4 portholes was similar to your first diving suits. Each of them had 4 faces, and they did not turn as they moved. The smaller saucers were something like your own LEMs, lunar excursion modules, small, short-range vehicles used for exploratory missions. Above them, the larger interplanetary vessel waited. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above the throne was a figure like that of a man. Ezekiel 1 verse 26. The latter individual on the large vessel was supervising and coordinating the movements of the creators. Frightened by all this, Ezekiel fell flat on his face, because those mysterious events had to come from no one other than God. But one of the creators said to him, "Son of man, stand up and let me talk with you. Listen to what I say. Eat what I give you." Ezekiel 2, verse 1 and 7 and 8. This is an image, like the eating from the scientific tree of good and evil. It was intellectual food that he was given. In this case, it was a book. Then I saw a hand stretched out to me holding a scroll. It was written all over on both sides. There was writing on both sides, a very surprising thing at that time when usually only one side of a parchment was written on. Then the scroll is eaten. This means that Ezekiel absorbed its meaning. What he learned is what you are learning now about humanity's origins. It was so exciting and comforting that he said, So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey. Ezekiel 3, verse 3. Then Ezekiel is transported in the Creator's vessel to the place where he was to spread the good news. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me a loud rumbling sound. Ezekiel 3, verse 12. Further on, the prophet is transported once again by the Creator's flying machine. The Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem. Ezekiel 8, verse 3. Ezekiel noticed afterwards that beneath their wings the cherubims had hands like humans, and there appeared in the cherubims the form of a man's hand under their wings. Ezekiel 10, verse 8. While I watched, the cherubims spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. Ezekiel 10, verse 19. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me. Ezekiel 11, verse 1. The glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city and stopped above the mountain, which was on the east side of the city. Afterwards, the Spirit took me up and brought me into Chaldea. Ezekiel 11, verses 23 through 24. There you have some of the many journeys of Ezekiel in the Creator's flying machines. Later, another experience is described. Yahweh set me down in the middle of the valley, which was full of bones. Ezekiel 37, verse 1. And there a miracle happens. The creators go on to resurrect human beings whose only remains are their bones. As mentioned earlier, each cell of a living being contains all the information to reconstruct it completely. All you have to do is place a single cell, for example from bone remains, in a machine, which provides all the living matter required to reconstruct that original being. The machine supplies the matter, and the cell supplies all the required information, just as a spermatozoon contains all the information necessary to create a living being in the first place, right down to the colour of the hair and eyes. Son of man, can these bones live? There was a noise, and behold a shaking. The sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them. They came to life and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Ezekiel 37, verse 3 through 10. All this is very easy to do, and you will do it someday. This is the origin of the ancient rituals in which elaborately protective sepulchres were built to bury great people, so that one day they may be brought back to life everlasting. This is part of the secret of the tree of life, the secret of eternity. In chapter 40, Ezekiel is again carried away in a spacecraft, which takes him into the presence of someone wearing a spacesuit. He took me there, and set me upon a very high mountain, on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. And behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze. Ezekiel 40, verse 2 through 3. This city is one of the earth bases that the creators used at that time. They were always located on very high mountains, so that the creators would not be disturbed by humans. The man whose appearance was like bronze is, of course, wearing a metallic suit. Similarly, due to our small stature, we were often mistaken for children or cherubs. The priests, in serving the creators in their terrestrial residence, the temple visited by Ezekiel, wore aseptic clothing when performing their duties, and those clothes always had to remain in the temple to avoid being contaminated by germs dangerous to the creators. When the priests have entered the holy place, they shall not enter the outer court without leaving behind the garments they have worn while performing their duties, for these are holy. Ezekiel 42, verse 14. They should have written, for these garments are pure or sterile, but that was incomprehensible for primitive people, who deified all that was told or shown to them at that period. In Ezekiel chapter 43, the big vessel respectfully called the glory of God approached. And I saw the glory of God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. Ezekiel 43, verse 2. The creators did not want to be disturbed, so they issued a directive. This gate is to remain shut. It shall not be opened, and no man shall enter by it, because Yahweh God of Israel has entered in by it. Therefore it shall be shut. Ezekiel 44, verse 2. Only a prince is allowed to come and speak with the creators. The prince himself is the only one who may sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of Yahweh. Ezekiel 44, verse 3. But the prince had to pass through a chamber where he was disinfected by special rays. He shall enter by way of the porch of that gate, and shall go out the same way. Ezekiel 44, verse 3. The Levite priests were there to look after the creators. They shall come near to me to minister unto me, and they shall come before me, to offer unto me the fat and the blood. And they shall come near to my table, to minister unto me. Ezekiel 44, verse 15 through 16. The odour of human perspiration was unpleasant to the creators. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they must be clothed with linen garments. They shall not gird themselves with anything that causeth sweat. Ezekiel 44, verse 17 through 18.
There is a description also of how the Elohim's supply of fresh products continued.
The best of all your first fruits, and the first of your dough, you will give to the priests, so a blessing may rest on your household. Ezekiel 44, verse 30.
In chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar condemned 3 men to the stake for refusing to worship a metal god instead of the Creator's. But the 3 men who knew of the Creator's existence were saved by one Creator who came to their aid in the glowing fire. Armed with a repellent and refrigerative ray, he protected them from the heat and the flames with this and allowed them to walk away totally unscathed.
I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Daniel 3, verse 25.
Further on, Daniel is cast into the lion's den, but the lions do not harm him. There again, nothing too complicated was involved, just a paralyzing beam to give enough time to get Daniel out of the den unharmed.
My God has sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth. Daniel 6, verse 22.
In the 10th chapter of Daniel, you will find another interesting description of a creator.
I looked up and saw a man. His body gleamed like topaz. His face shone like lightning. His eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet sparkled like a disc of bronze. And when he spoke, his voice sounded like the voice of a multitude. Daniel 10, verses 5 through 6.